It's really an honor to be here with you. I know that you've been following Colombia closely. And basically what I wanted to share with you today is what I call the flip side of the argument of what we're seeing from the government perspective in economic and social matters. So I've called this presentation The Quest for Economic Recovery. What is it that we need to do in the following years? And the starting point of this presentation is that reality matters. Why do I begin with this? Because we've seen a lot of information coming out of the Colombian government saying that the numbers don't look so bad, that if we compare ourselves to other countries, we're not looking so bad. But I think the most important thing is, are we really looking at us the way we should? Are the Colombian fiscal authorities looking at the numbers the way we should? So this is why this picture, it's important. Because it happens that sometimes you can have a delusion because you look at the mirror and you're looking at a different self from reality. And this is the first argument that I want to put on the table. Why? Because basically for the last 15 years, we have experienced the most profound super cycle of commodity prices. It's like we started in this amazing party, and we were having this joyful time where commodities came at the highest peak of prices in many, many years, and for a long period of time. What was the trigger of this? One could say, well, China was growing importantly. There was a lot of liquidity in the markets, and especially in commodities, China became a dominant consumer. So during those 15 years, China became the consumer of 50% of the global coal offer of product, 47% of copper, 40% of cement. And obviously, it became 10% of the world oil consumption. And it became the trigger of the new consumption pattern at a very drastic pace. All this, I could say, was assumed by Colombia with a lot of success. We did the right reforms at the right time so that we could take advantage of that super cycle of commodity prices. But what happened, it's also important. During those years where we had the democratic security strategy of President Uribe that allowed oil investors going to far places of our land to start doing new exploration and start building a new structure of connection with the global markets. It took us basically 5 years to build the great bonanza, the great boom of our time. So during the Uribe administration, we passed from something close to 300,000 barrels per day to 900,000 barrels per day. But it was the Santos administration between 2010 and 2015 who made the best out of that boom. And they received something close to $20 billion out of dividends from Ecopetrol and the taxing policies for the oil sector. The biggest boom derived from oil in the Colombian history. $20 billion. Now what happened when we had the boom? And this brings me to this other equation. We became addicted to oil. 50% of our exports were oil. 70% of dividends derived from public companies came out of oil because Ecopetrol is a dominant player. 40% of our foreign direct investment was focused on the sector, and almost 40% of the currency market depended on oil. But we're not a big oil player. Our reserves are for less than 7 years. 70% of the Colombian oil fields produce less than 1,000 barrels per day. But we were in the party. It looked very comfortable. And nobody thought the party was going to end. And in fact, the government, when they planned all their fiscal policy, they assumed that the price of a barrel of oil was going to be $100 per barrel for the next 10 years. So, it became the Tony Montana School of Business theory. The party is not going to end. We have to spend because we have resources. What had happened, that the budget grew at a pace of 11.5%, while the economy was growing at a pace of 4.5%. And since we assumed that this was going to be a permanent boom, the government expanded all the permanent expenses, and they never realized that the boom was going to be transitory. Now, what did we do with the money? This is a very important thing. Because what you look here in the blue squares are the taxes collections. They grew a lot based on the boom. And it basically doubled over 5 years, from 70 billion to almost 140. But what you see in orange is how the budget grew as well. So it grew higher. And then you could say, well, Mr. Duque, but don't try to exaggerate, because maybe you did something good with that money. Maybe you did something important socially with that bonanza, with that boom. And what you see in the line above the squares is the Gini coefficient. Was our expenditure really used to reduce inequality, and was it effective in reducing inequality? Doesn't seem like it was when you look at the graph. And when you look at subsidies, social subsidies, in the same period of time, jumped from 40 billion pesos to 72 billion pesos. That's more than $20 billion. And the most important subsidy that is being paid with that figure is pensions. But it happens that almost 70% of pension subsidies are being used for the highest quintile of income. So you're not doing an effective redistribution of resources. And that is very important to judge whether the fiscal policy was sound or not. Now this brings me to this other circumstance. When you have a big oil boom, and especially if you're not a big oil player, you should use those resources to diversify your economy. Invest in science, technology, innovation, industry. But we did not. More than 50% of our exports to the US, oil. Something close to 62% of the exports for the EU, oil. 71% of the exports to China, oil, and even in the new markets like India, it was above 70%. So how come that we never use resources from the boom to diversify and to use investment in other sectors that are crucial for an economy that needs to identify new sources of employment generation? That was another mistake. And the party's over because the oil price dropped 50% in price in the last 3 years. Now what can we do? Did we save for the rainy days? We did not. Because we always thought the party was not going to end, so why save? So now that the party's over, the next question is, how is it that we're going to face the difficulty? And this is the part of the big question mark that I always place on the Santos administration. They try to substitute an oil boom for new taxes. So is that a sound fiscal policy? That your first source of income has a drop in the price of 50% and you decide to substitute it with more taxes? But this is what happened. When you look at corporate rates in Colombia, income corporate rates, in the year 2017, we're going to have a corporate rate of 34%, which is above world average, Latin American average, OECD average, and North American average. I don't think that's a sound policy at all. Because actually, in fact, if you have earnings above $250,000, your income rate is not 34, it's 40 for this year. And that hurts. And the government also raised the taxes on consumers. They raised the VAT tax from 16 to 19 at a time of high inflation and economic deceleration. So, corporations feel they're drowning. Some do. Because when you look at all the aggregate amount of taxes in Colombia, you have real tax rates above 60%. If you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, you can be even above 72%. And that hurts. So, what else did the administration do? They tried and they sell the new taxing policy as a way to simplify it. But I've always loved this phrase from John Marshall, who said, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So you need to have a taxing system that is aligned to your long-term objectives. Productivity, formalization, investment, savings. And it happens that the system that we currently have conspires against all those. So it doesn't help at all. And actually, our tax code has more words than the Wealth of Nations. That's for you not to read it, okay? But if it was going to be simplified, now it has more articles than it did have before the reform was even discussed. And that also helps me to analyze something. If we raise taxes at time of deceleration, and if we raise corporate tax and consumer tax, what's the effect going to be? And what is the effect now? Today, we have seen the worst weakening of industrial confidence since 2001. And we have seen one of the worst weakenings of consumer confidence in the last 24 months. Why? Because the taxing rates are affecting the people who must generate the formal jobs. And it also produces incentives and negative incentives for smuggling. If you have a VAT tax of 19%, and if you're in a country with more than 30% of the products that are sold on the streets are smuggled, this is party time. So we also need to think about that. And what's the snowball effect of all this bad decision making in my perspective? The first thing is formalization. If you ask me what is the biggest illness we have in the Colombian economy, I would say it's informality. Make no mistake about it. 50% of our working force is employed informally. And I like the poll that our National Statistics Bureau produces when they ask people if they work. Lady or gentleman, have you worked at least for an hour during the last week with or without payment? If you respond yes, welcome to the employed population. Why are you laughing? That's the way it is. I'm not kidding. That's the way it is. So when we look at informality and what the impact of informality is, I would say the first one is that it makes our pension system unsustainable. Because we have, according to that poll, 22 million people employed, but only 7 million contribute to pension and health, and only 2 are the ones who are receiving a pension. So that's something close to a 90% informality in the long term, especially in a country where you now have 5 million people above 65 years old, and you're going to have 15 by the year 2050. So you see what it takes, informality, in terms of how does it affect the financial sustainability of the pension system? But it also affects the health system. I'm going to jump this a little bit. It affects the health system because we designed a health reform in the 90s, very famous, called Ley 100, and it had a very important objective. Let's formalize the economy so that we can have more people contributing to the health system, and we're going to give some subsidies for the poorest of the poor. Well, today there are more people in the subsidy system than in the contribution system. And if the informality continues, well, it's going to affect the cash flow of the health system. In a country where we also have this problem now, and is that we have one of the highest youth unemployment rates in Latin America, which is above 16%. And if that's so, let me make it even harder when we look at rural areas of Colombia. When you look at the rural sector in Colombia, and this is interesting, it's like, you remember maybe when you were in school, that you could have maybe a classmate who was very tall and he looked like very, very strong. But when it came to sports, it was a mess. When you look at the Colombian agricultural sector, the big numbers look amazing. Something close to 7% of GDP. Something close to 20% of the Colombian population. And when you look at exports, 18% of our exports, compared with other countries in the region, it looks strong. But when it comes to sports, the worst performance in education is in the rural areas. 80% of the people are informal, and 70% of the people earn less than a minimum wage. So the coverage of social services in the rural areas, it's very poor, and it has the biggest challenge of informality. Now, how can we change this direction in the rural sector? I say is linked to formalization. And who can formalize? Companies do. But how can you formalize with the taxing pressure that you have currently? So you need to have a reform, a serious reform. And then, this is the other word. I suppose that you have heard this along this morning, post-conflicto. So, well, post-conflicto, it's a big question. Now, is this peace? Well, I say it's an agreement. It's a paperwork. It's there. And some reforms ought to happen. But do we really have the institutional capacity to accomplish what was written on those papers? And can we allow our country to see illegal crops growing the way they are, that they have tripled in the last 3 years, and they are higher than they were before Plan Colombia was even started? So peace is not an agreement, and it's not a piece of paper. It's how can you really implement in order to have the truthful and permanent absence of violence? So that's why, from our perspective, there were substantial mistakes making there, but I'm not going to take too long about it, but just to say that I'm very much against of a peace deal that makes drug dealing a political crime that can be rewarded with amnesty. And I'm pretty much against an agreement that allows coca eradication to be voluntarily, not mandatory. And I'm also against an agreement where there are no specific compromises from FARC to turn on their fortune to be used for victim reparation. And the way they build the justice reform, I don't think it's sound at all. But that's not the big question you have, with me at least, about post-conflict. Your question is, how much is it going to cost? And you all remember this great American show, The Price is Right? Raise your hand who remember The Price is Right. En Colombia decíamos el precio es correcto, Gloria Valencia Castaños. I've seen like 10 amounts of different magnitude depending on the government agency who uses the number. Some have said, well, it's something close to $100 billion over 20 years. Others have said it's 20, 60, 80. Nobody knows. Because I don't think there's a clear institutional design to know if we are really going to build the land bank that has been promoted by the government, or the land jurisdiction, or even the substitution, or even the development of social works in the places that have been under the influence of FARC historically. But if we assume that it's $100 billion in the next 20 years, that's a lot of money. And that's a lot of money at a time of fiscal pressure. And also fiscal uncertainty because, for example, last year the government said they were going to reduce the fiscal deficit from 4 to 3.3 in 2017. Are we? If we have a growth of 1.5? No, it's not going to happen. The government also said to rating agencies that this tax reform was going to give them a substantial amount of money that was going to be used to reduce the fiscal deficit. But after they sustained, they changed some of the outlooks from negative to positive, their response is, now we have a new budgetary increase proposal that is going to increase it in $3 billion. So make no mistake, the deficit for this year is going to be something around 4% of GDP. Now, the post-Santos sometimes looks like a scary movie. It looks like a scary movie. I mean, saying all these things that I've been talking about, this guy is like Dr. Doom. But wait for a second, I have good news after all. But it looks like a scary movie. Huge economic deceleration, social unrest derived from the pressure of some populist political groups saying, you see, after 10 years of a boom, what did you receive after all? The same thing that happened in Brazil. Populist movements trying to build social unrest. And the third thing is obviously corruption. We have seen scandals in the country that are also going to be used by populists to exacerbate people's unrest. That worries me. And in fact, it worries me at a time of a huge fiscal hole. Because our fiscal rule says we have to reduce the fiscal deficit from 4% of GDP to 1% of GDP in 2022. 3% of GDP adjustment in times of deceleration, post-conflict, FARC populism in the rural areas. Can we really take that road? Is that road going to be helpful for the country? So this is what I call my recovery plan. Or our, we can all work it out. What is it that we're proposing now? The first thing, we need to reduce or eliminate all unnecessary spending. We've spent it in the last 6 years, something close to $2 billion in marketing and advertising in government agencies. It's a huge number. We have expanded bureaucracy in the central government in something close to 18,000 new posts. So we need to eliminate those unnecessary expenses. And something that I think ought to be done is when you look at the Colombian budget, 60% of our budget is not used for capital formation, gross capital formation. So you need to reclassify or otherwise assume that 40% of your investment budget is used for current expenses. I think we need to do a better classification and try to build a budgeting for results scheme that is workable and that it's also believable. The second thing, cut red tape. You might think it sounds obvious, but today, if you're in the corporate system, you want to have a tax return, it takes 14 months. 14 months that you have to go to a bank and request a loan and pay a 12% rate while you receive your return. So we want to make tax returns more agile, more efficient, and try to reduce it to 6 months maximum, which for me is still high. But I think it's a credible and believable target. Also, we have a figure in Colombia called renta presuntiva. It's like a presumptive income tax that you have to pay beforehand based on your assets and an assumption of what your assets might produce. I think we have to eliminate that figure, and we have to be more modern in our taxing system for that, and also reduce the anticipation of taxes for corporations, because at times of deceleration, cash flow is key. Third, this is more controversial, but we have to lower corporate taxes to a competitive measure. I believe something between 28 and 29 is credible. But I also believe we can lower the VAT tax but expand the base. So we reduce the tariff, we expand the base so we can have a broader amount of products, and for the poorest of the poor, use the same figure that Uruguay has done to return the expenses of family consumption, basic family consumption. And it has proven to be a right measure in Uruguay. Now this has to go hand in hand with investment incentives. If we need formalization in the rural areas, if we need investment in aggregated value companies, then we have to reward that for the amount of formal permanent jobs that you create. This is needed at this moment if we also want to have a connection between this new economic policy with also the generation of formal jobs in the country. Fifth, fight VAT and income tax evasion. We have a tax evasion on income that is something close to 45%, and in VAT something close to 41%. So the target of using new technologies, increasing the density of fiscalization workers at our IRS equivalent, DIAN in Colombia, and having more regional presence, we need to have a target to reduce at least in 40% those evasions, and that will bring us more than 8 billion pesos per year. This year, the investment that has been done by DIAN on fiscalization is working. With the density, with the technology, with the capacity to monitor. So that has to be a target of our economic policy. 6, export diversification. When we look at a country like the US, that is our major trading partner, and we have a free trade agreement, and we find out that only 5% of Colombian corporations export to the US, something is wrong. We need to do something there, and we need to make, for companies, it's easier to get to that market. And also to open the market for new products. But that means that we have to connect our industrial sector with global value-added chains. 7, this is something that Alberto Bernal loves. Develop local capital markets. We are maybe Latin America, 3rd or 4th major economy, but we have a local capital markets when we only have 77 listed companies. And only 5 companies trade more than $5 million per day. So we need to develop those capital markets, and we need to have more incentives so that people can bring their savings to be used for enterprise and corporate development in the country. That's a must. We ought to think like that now. And if you have to make your taxing system more flexible, make it. But it's important that you link savings to corporate development, where those corporations can get resources for a longer term and in better rates. 8, business environment, country cost. When you look at Colombia, our industrial energy rates or tariffs are one of the highest in the region. And if you want to put your company or your industry close to our ports, it's even more costly. So we need to find a regulation where we put an end to all the dilutions inside, so that we can open for a more robust market, and that robust market can be equivalent to better rates. And in logistics, I am pretty confident that we have to continue what has been started by the Uribe and the Santos administration on the key roads that have to be put in competitive routes in Colombia. But you've heard a lot of 4Gs, and I have to be realistic on that. Most of the 4G roads that were sold worldwide had a financial model of an economic growth of 4.5. Now we're going to have a growth lower than 2. They were also built on the assumption of an inflation of 3% and not 4.5%. An exchange rate of 2,300 pesos per dollar to something close to 3,000 pesos per dollar. And also the flow of vehicles tied to a boom of commodities that you no longer have. So that is going to have an impact on overcost, and when we have to act severely with very sound policies. But that's going to be part of the fiscal debate. Make no mistake about it. And it's better to put it right here in the scene than just to leave it under the carpet as the government is doing right now. 9, fiscal rule realignment. I love the fiscal rule. I've cheered for the fiscal rule. But the problem with the fiscal rule is that we need to adjust it to be even more transparent. Because what the government did in times of a boom is they took dividends from Ecopetrol, they put it in their pockets, they spent it, and still they were complying with the fiscal rule. But then Ecopetrol had to go in debt to finance their investment program. So in order to have credibility for the fiscal rule, I say and I propose that 50% of all the income that we get out from oil has to be sterilized. And you can only use the proceeds. And the other 50%, you can only use it for gross capital formation in investment. To finish the works of the 4G, to increase the investment in human capital, but not to expand the subsidies like crazy, and then figure it out that your whole social safety net is dependent on an oil boom. And 10, value-added industrial transformation. Connect our corporations with value chains inside Colombia for the Colombian market and obviously for the international market. Those 10 elements are the ones that I am proposing as a presidential candidate and are going to be written tomorrow in Portafolio, our economic newspaper, that I hope you can cut it with your scissors and save it for the year 2022 so you can look at me and say, did you accomplish? Obviously, you have to vote for me first. But I want you to cut it and keep it. All this brings me to this equation. We need to change our stem cells, our economic stem cells, because we need to change the old model of oil dependency, commodity dependency, not diversification, and a taxing code that is obstructing corporate development. So that's why in my program, that is now in a book that I just gave to Alberto, and Alberto wrote a very nice article last week that also made my mother very proud. What we're proposing is a whole vision where we can integrate 5 elements. First element, rule of law. Libertad y orden. That's what the Colombian National Seal has. Rule of law. Equality, education, health, justice, culture, to provide those basic elements of access for the whole Colombian population. What I call this conscious capitalism. I want to say this, yes, this is not propaganda, but I'm one of the promoters of B corporations in Colombia, benefit corporations. We have a bill that it's doing very well in Congress, and hopefully it will be a law by the end of the year. I believe when I talk about conscious capitalism, that we need to strengthen our market economy, but at the same time, try to make our growth be part of a social transformation in Colombia. That people perceive that the growth is benefiting them. If we do that, it's the best way to prevent populism to rise in Colombia. Conscious capitalism. Then I talk about innovation. Social innovation, creative industry, industrial transformation, entrepreneurship. Cities that are well planned and that are sustainable. And the last element is sustainability. Social sustainability, formal jobs, permanent formal jobs. So I love that. Permanent formal jobs bring income. Income reduces inequality. Inequality produces happiness. The pursuit of happiness. I love that phrase from the founding fathers in the US, the pursuit of happiness as an element that can be shared in society. And obviously, environmental sustainability that is feeded with the water of citizen participation and enlightened by transparency. That is the vision that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for listening to me. Muchas gracias.